They took off into a sky that felt like black velvet and brass. The runway lights a narrow, distant ribbon, the concrete warm beneath the Wellington's wheels. It was 2:02 on December 3, 1942, and for most of the men crowded into the handful of bombers lifting from RAF Wellington Lodge that night, the mission ahead was bone-deep routine. Rendezvous with the bomber stream, fly to the target, do the job, come home if the gods and flak allowed it. But tucked into the stream like a single, deliberate fingernail among many, Wellington DG carried a different burden. Its crew had been briefed in a language that carried less pomp and more precision, frequencies, pulse patterns, oscilloscopes, and the cold arithmetic of radio waves. Their objective did not read like a raid. It read like a test: make the Germans reveal the electronic heartbeat of their night defense, then survive long enough to send it home. Edwin Ted Poulton sat cramped at the controls, the night sky reflected in the glass before him. He had the pilot's calm, small, measured movements, thumbs that knew the feel of the control column. Beside him, the navigator Bill Barry clicked a pencil and ran a quick line across a map. Around them the Wellington thrummed, engines twin and steady, the geodesic fuselage creaking like an old ship in a long, slow sea. They were a small crew by name, but a crowded family by necessity. Harold Jordan, the special duty operator, was hunched over a receiver mounted mid-fuselage, his knuckles white on the oscilloscope's edge. Jordan had the operator's patience, hours of listening, watching, coaxing signal from noise. In the back, the wireless operator, Bill Bigaray, fingers perpetually itching toward the transmitter keys, was the sort of man who could send words into the dark and have them find their way. Flight Sergeant Everett Vachon manned the turret, ever watchful. Fred Grant, the front turret gunner, kept an eye on the sky, as if it were a living thing. Quiet jokes and clipped orders passed between them like small lifelines. They climbed through cold, thin air. Below, the fens and ridges of Cambridgeshire dissolved into a black, textured map. The bomber stream, those dark shapes colliding and splaying across the night, was a living thing itself, a slow, grinding river of steel and human will, a focus machine that existed to go somewhere and break things for a reason bigger than any one man. DG nestled in, indistinguishable at first glance. That was the point. Not everyone on board understood the full scale of why they had been singled out for this job. Some took comfort in routine. Others felt the electric hum of significance and fear. The briefing had been practical and unadorned. No heroics. Keep to the plan. If engaged, record everything. Get the frequency. Send it. Survive if you can. That last clause hung in the air like a polite but real question, one the men answered in the only way they could, with movements, with prep checks, with the tightening of leather straps. The plan was quiet in its audacity. On paper it read like a small, ugly risk. Fall back from a stream, act like trouble, attract a predator, let the electronics do the rest. In practice it was a wager against chance, against weather, against the accuracy of a single German night fighter, against whether radio ears on both sides would cooperate. At stake was something the crew could not see and could barely imagine, a handful of numbers and waveforms that would tell British scientists how the Luftwaffe found them after dark, and how to blind it. Inside the Wellington, the cabin lights were dim to amber. Breath made brief clouds in the air. Instruments sent up a small cathedral of needles and dials. Jordan's oscilloscope glowed with a steady, indifferent blue. Occasionally, his hand would flick a knob, and the trace would sharpen or blur. He murmured notes into a small pad, frequency estimates, the shape of pulses, any anomaly that might one day be translated into a weapon or a shield. Ted glanced across at him. "You sure you'll pick it up tonight?" he asked in a voice too low for the rest to overhear. Jordan didn't look up. "If there's a Lichtenstein out there, I'll hear it," he said. His voice had the flat, hard edge worn by men who had seen too much of the dark. And if not, he let the sentence hang. There was an unspoken finish to it. They would not be alone long. By 4:30 the stream would be inside German airspace, the horizon already strange with distant glows from burning towns and the faint, hungry flashes of searchlights. But before the heat of the target and the thunder of bombs, there would be a quieter, more intimate danger. Night fighters prowling like cats between shafts of light and radar beams, their noses bristling with antenna arrays that whispered in frequencies the British only began to understand. The Wellington was tasked to be a signal as much as a plane. The right shape, the right vulnerability, the right temptation. It would pretend, briefly, to be failing, to be dropping off the pace. Then it would wait for the answer from the dark, a radio heartbeat, a vector, and a shadow falling from the sky. Ted felt the weight of the moment not as doctrine, but as a human pressure behind his sternum. He thought of family pictures at home in Windsor, Ontario, of winters and local streets with names he would probably never see again, and he thought of the men beside him whose hands he could name in the dark. The mission was sterile in its description, but now, with Cambridge sheer falling away and the bomber stream unspooling toward enemy lines, it became deeply, painfully human. They eased into the stream. For a time, the world was simply a careful choreography of lights and black metal. Then a subtle change happened. They followed the plan, dropped back. The Wellington, once a shadow among others, became an isolated figure against the night. It was the moment the whole flight had been designed to create, the bait cast out into a dangerous pool. As DG slipped away from the comforting presence of the formation, Harold Jordan hunched closer to his instruments. Somewhere ahead, something awaited. The night held its breath. What the crew could not know then, what they would only learn in the blind, noisy seconds that would follow, was that this single decision, this small gamble of a bomber playing wounded for science, would echo in laboratories and drawing rooms, leading to countermeasures that would change how the night war was fought. But that lay ahead, dense and complex and far from their present worry. For now, there was only the black, the hum of engines, the soft click of map pins, and the small, stubborn act of people doing what had been asked of them, to go out into the dark and listen. By 1942, the scale of the air war had matured from tentative probing raids into something industrial, a deliberate policy aimed at breaking an enemy's war-making capacity and, crucially, its will to fight. The British Air Ministry's directive was blunt and bureaucratic: apply pressure where it hurt and keep the pressure on. Under the iron certainty of Air Chief Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris, Bomber Command moved from surgical raids to sustained, area-wide attacks. The target list read like a map of German industry, the Ruhr and other manufacturing hubs, transport nodes, and city centers whose factories, workers, and infrastructure powered the German war effort. For the men in the flak-blackened skies, the strategy translated into long nights and a steady drumbeat of sorties. Heavy four-engine bombers and sturdy twins left British fields in waves, aiming to saturate targets with explosives and set whole urban areas ablaze. The logic was strategic, the reality was human and terrifying. Towns burned, crews were lost, and each mission carved deeper into the nerves of the air crews who carried them out. Harris was unapologetic. To him, the bombing campaign was a blunt instrument of total war. Morale and industry were inseparable in a nation mobilized for conflict. Politically and militarily, that doctrine had backing. It also carried grim practical consequences. As Bomber Command escalated the tempo and scale of its operations, German defenses adapted as quickly as their science and resources allowed. The RAF had already learned the price of daylight precision attacks. Early in the war, daylight raids had been necessary to hit certain targets, but the Luftwaffe's fighters and flak batteries exacted such heavy tolls that the RAF shifted to the relative concealment of night. Night bombing reduced certain kinds of losses. It became harder for German fighters to intercept, harder for flak to zero in, but it also opened a new front in a technological contest. At night, the skies were no longer a simple arena of aircraft and guns. They became a theater of detection and deception. Searchlights, acoustic locators, and ground radar concentrated defensive power, and the Luftwaffe refined coordinated systems to vector their night fighters accurately into a bomber stream. The British moved to area bombing to blunt the efficiency of German night defenses, but the increasing sophistication of radio and radar-directed night fighters in 1942 produced a worrying rise in losses. Bomber Command simply could not sustain attrition rates that threatened not only aircraft, but the trained crews wielding them. Inside the leadership, debates were sharp and often bitter. Should Bomber Command press on with mass area attacks despite the steep cost, or diversify tactics in search of a technological edge? Harris and his supporters argued that relentless pressure was the only path to strategic victory. Others fretted about the growing human toll and the need for better ways to protect men in the air. The answer, inevitably, would not be purely doctrinal. It would be technical. Pressure from the front lines mixed with pressure from laboratories, where physicists and engineers pushed to turn raw science into practical countermeasures. The escalation in bomber losses made a technological solution more than desirable. It became urgent. If German night fighters were being guided by some new system, then only by knowing exactly how that system worked could the RAF hope to blunt it. Intelligence, not only human reconnaissance or aerial photography, but technical signals intelligence, suddenly had a prominence matching the urgency of victory. This was not just about building better guns or adding more armor. It was about listening. Electromagnetism, radio propagation, pulse repetition, frequency bands. Words that once lived comfortably in textbooks now ran the war. The British needed data, precise frequencies, pulse shapes, timing intervals. With those numbers, scientists could devise jamming tactics, camouflage measures, or deception systems that would, in effect, break the Luftwaffe's ability to find them when the lights went out. For bomber crews, this shift to electronic warfare had practical consequences. Training now included an awareness of being bait or instrument for intelligence collection. Special flights were planned whose objective did not involve dropping bombs on factories, but rather drew attention like a lamp in a dark room, hoping the predators would show themselves. Men who had once thought their job was to drop their load and return were now asked to become living sensors, to fall out of formation, act the wounded, and stand still while the enemy tried to finish them off. The psychology of that ask was frank and raw. It required a level of discipline and quiet bravery that organized courage seldom expresses in speeches. At the same time, the RAF itself was reorganizing how it fought. Radar stations on the ground were improved, night fighter tactics evolved, and the idea of electronic warfare, once a phrase of laboratory curiosity, entered doctrinal thinking. It was the beginning of a new arms race in the sky, one where the weapon was not always a shell or a bomb, but a signal in the ether. So the stage was set. Bomber Command would keep pressing the offensive. Its crews would continue to fly into darkness above flak and searchlight beams. But tucked behind those long-term strategic plans lay a more clandestine campaign, to know how the enemy saw them at night, and to learn how to make that sight blind. The next step would be technical, surgical, and dangerous. Gather the emissions, record them, and turn them into countermeasures that might finally curb the night fighters' toll. As winter closed in over England, and the bomber stream rehearsed its nocturnal rituals, a few small units trained for missions unlike any other, flights that were not measured by tons of ordnance delivered but by kilohertz, microseconds, and the crackle of a wireless key. In those quiet, precarious operations, ordinary aircrews were now part espionage, part science experiment. Theirs would be a dangerous, invisible form of combat, fighting with ears and oscilloscopes as much as with guns. And into that uncertain strategy stepped the men of number 1474 Flight, the modified Wellingtons, and the crews who would, by choice or command, expose themselves to the dark to learn how the night truly worked. By the late 1930s, the skies had acquired a second topography, an invisible landscape of radio waves, pulses, and reflected echoes. That unseen terrain became as strategically important as runways, factories, or convoys. What started as theoretical tinkering in university labs and Navy yards quickly snapped into a wartime imperative. Whoever mastered detection, direction finding, and deception of radio energy would gain a decisive advantage after dusk. Technically, the idea was straightforward enough to state, but fiendishly difficult to implement. Send a burst of radio energy, wait for anything reflective to bounce back, and measure the time it took. That delay translated directly into range. Sweep an antenna, and the angular position of the return gave direction. Add more sophistication, measure pulse shapes, timing, and frequency, and you could make a picture of the sky that was invisible to the human eye. In practice, however, making that simple concept work at the ranges, resolutions, and reliabilities needed for wartime required breakthroughs in electronics, antennas, and signal processing. Across Europe and beyond, governments poured resources into that work. Laboratories and workshops in France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, the Soviet Union, and the United States moved from curiosity-driven experiments to concentrated programs with national security urgency. Radar stopped being a novelty and became a program of prioritized research, secret budgets, and urgency-laden memos. Britain moved early and with particular purpose. Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast became the nucleus of a national effort. There, engineers and physicists tuned transmitters and raised towering arrays for a system that would be called chain home. By the late 1930s, those stations could detect aircraft at scores of miles and give fighter command the lead time it needed to scramble interceptors. But the chain home approach, massive fixed antennas blasting lower frequency radio energy, had limits. It was excellent for long-range early warning, but poor at telling a night fighter exactly where a bomber sat in the dark. Moreover, fixed ground stations could not reach below a certain altitude and lacked the precision needed for close-range interception. That problem pushed two parallel lines of invention. One was miniaturization and refinement so radar could be carried on an aircraft. The other was the hunt for higher frequencies and more powerful transmitters. Higher frequency, shorter wavelength. Radar allowed smaller antennas and finer resolution. Crucial if you want an airborne set to detect another plane at a few miles range rather than the dozens of miles that ground stations covered. These technical constraints, power output, antenna size, receiver sensitivity, dictated design trade-offs and set the cadence of the race. Engineers and labs learned to wage war on noise. Receivers had to pick up faint echoes against a background of static and interference. Oscilloscopes had to produce readable traces, and transmitters needed stable, repeatable pulses so that return signals could be interpreted. Pulse repetition frequency, pulse width, and the bandwidth of the receiver all mattered. Small differences in those parameters could make a detection system usable or worthless in the chaos of combat. Secrecy and counterintelligence gave this scientific contest another dimension. Each side learned that a successful radar installation was only as good as its operational security. Antennas were big and obvious. The existence of a new, effective system could be discovered by careful reconnaissance, by intercepted communications, or worst of all, by a captured piece of equipment or a coerced technician. So laboratories went black, designs were compartmentalized, and test sites were guarded. At the same time, intelligence services worked to identify enemy frequencies and pulse patterns, the raw data that would allow electronic countermeasures to be built. Both sides also experimented with deception and jamming as soon as detection became reliable. If you can create spurious echoes, confuse operators with false bearings, or saturate a receiver with noise, you could blunt the effectiveness of enemy radars. Early ideas were crude, noise generators, improvised reflectors, but they hinted at a future in which war over the air would often be a contest of signals rather than solely of shells and bullets. The airborne interception, AI, problem was particularly urgent. Ground radars could tell you an intruder was coming. They could rarely point a single fighter into the precise space where a bomber would be visible in the dark. For that, a fighter needed its own radar, one that was compact, rugged, and efficient, an enormous engineering challenge given the power supplies, space, and aerodynamics involved. Strapping large, forward-projecting arrays to an airplane created drag and handling issues, yet without those awkward antenna rigs the Luftwaffe and RAF alike would lack the ability to see at night. The wartime pace of progress was dizzying. Technical leaps that might once have taken years were compressed into months. Highly practical inventions, better transmitter valves, improved receivers, smarter displays, mattered more than theoretical elegance. Laboratories, machine shops, and frontline squadrons formed a feedback loop. Engineers built prototypes, air crews tested them under fire, and the results fed back into quicker redesigns. This close coupling of practice and theory accelerated the pace of innovation. Science also began to change the culture of air warfare. Radio engineers joined mission briefings. Signals officers rode in the fuselages of bombers. Doctrine that once centered on formations and flak now had to take into account kilohertz, microseconds, and polar patterns of antenna lobes. The battlefield had quietly become a laboratory, and the laboratory a battlefield. Finally, the electromagnetic race reshaped expectations about what victory would look like. Winning might no longer be only about numbers of aircraft or tonnage of bombs. It could depend on who listened better, who disguised better, who could cloak their own transmissions while blocking the enemy's. The coming years would prove that the side that paired engineering skill with operational daring could swing the odds decisively. In that changed world, a battered Wellington slipping back from the bomber stream was not simply an aircraft playing at distress. It had become a probe into the enemy's electronic soul. What its crew might capture on a glowing oscilloscope trace could be translated into tactics, into deception, and into survival for hundreds of other crews. The race was in the air, and it was changing the shape of war. The problem of finding an enemy at night turned out to be as much mechanical as it was mathematical. Ground-based chain home stations could shout across the sky and say, in effect, something big is out there bearing such and such, but they could rarely point an individual fighter to a bomber's exact position at night. The solution was obvious in principle and devilish in application. Put the eyes, and therefore the radar, onto the fighter itself. For the British, that solution took form in the MK, for airborne interception set. By June 1940, engineers had produced a unit small and rugged enough to be carried in twin-engine night fighters, such as the Bristol Beaufighter. The MK, didn't paint a high-resolution picture of the sky, but gave a pilot tactical, practical information, range and rough bearing, that could be translated into a firing pass once the two aircraft were within visual distance. Fitted with heavy armament, 20mm cannons that could break an enemy's spine with a single well-placed volley, the Beaufighter plus AIMK began to close the gap between detection and destruction. The combination produced results. The first AI-assisted Beaufighter victory in November 1940 signaled that airborne radar had entered the combat equation in a meaningful way. Germany's response was rapid and methodical. Their Freya ground system and later Würzburg fire control radars gave the Luftwaffe excellent early warning and vectoring capability. But a purpose-built airborne interception radar, the set the Germans codenamed Lichtenstein, was what really changed the night fighter game for them. Lichtenstein was a compact nose-mounted system whose forward-facing antenna array fed a cockpit display showing range and relative angle. It told the pilot essentially where to aim his plane. Despite the drag penalties imposed by the protruding antenna racks, the operational advantage was clear. A night fighter equipped with Lichtenstein could find a bomber more reliably than one relying on searchlight beams or ground vectoring alone. These airborne sets did more than add a new sensor. They altered the tactics of both sides. Fighters stopped being lone hunters waiting for searchlights and instead adopted coordinated approaches driven by radio intelligence. Interceptors would be guided to the vicinity of the bomber stream by ground control and then switch on their own radar to make the final contact. For the bombers, the problem was acute. A formation that once feared only splintering searchlights and flak now had to worry about small, agile aircraft equipped with instruments that could cut through darkness the way a knife cuts canvas. Implementation was messy and immediate. Airframes had to be modified to accept receivers, transmitters, and power supplies. Antenna arrays stuck out into the slipstream and reduced speed and maneuverability. Cockpit displays were primitive by later standards, oscilloscopes and needles that needed skilled interpretation. Pilots and radar operators had to learn a new language, interpreting blips and traces, converting abstract numbers into a mental model of the sky. The learning curve was steep. Early operators made mistakes. Early pilots misread returns, but the loop of testing and refinement was tight because real combat quickly exposed flaws. Each side borrowed and learned from every encounter. When British night fighters began to score with their AI sets, German engineers refined Lichtenstein's sensitivity and display. When the Luftwaffe enjoyed a period of success, RAF scientists looked for weaknesses in the emitted signals, frequencies, pulse rates, antenna patterns that could be exploited. These were not slow, polite exchanges of ideas, but rapid iterations born of operational necessity. A new transmitter valve here, a different pulse repetition there, and the balance of advantage could shift. One consequence of airborne radar's arrival was the increasing importance of specialized crews. The pilot was no longer lone master of his fate. Success depended on his radar operator's skill in reading a flickering trace and calling correct headings. Inter-service cooperation increased. Signals intelligence fed into operational control, which fed back into aircraft design. The cockpit, once strictly a domain of stick and throttle, now had room for technical dialogue and a new kind of crew discipline. Finally, these developments made clear a sobering strategic truth. The night war could not be won purely by brute force. It would be a contest of systems, hardware, human training, and the ability to innovate faster than the opponent. Airborne interception had become the crucible in which that contest was being decided. For crews like those on the Wellington DG, the arrival of enemy airborne radar made their mission not only dangerous, but also crucial. If they could force a German night fighter to switch on its Lichtenstein and capture the signature, they would hand scientists and airmen alike a way to fight back. By late 1942, the hard facts were becoming impossible to ignore. More bombers were failing to return, and survivor reports suggested that something new, something beyond searchlights and flak, was systematically finding the RAF at night. Intercepts and receiver logs hinted at a pattern in the ether. Short, regular bursts, a distinct cadence that suggested a purpose-built airborne set rather than the clumsy echoes of searchlights or the broad sweep of ground radar. But hints and guesses were not enough. Engineers and planners needed hard numbers, an exact frequency, a reliable measurement of pulse shape and repetition, and a clear record of the signal's timing. Only with that level of proof could they design jammers, tune deception measures, or advise tactics that might reduce the mounting toll on bomber crews. The military mind is pragmatic about uncertainty. You can act on incomplete information, but if the cost of action is high, you must increase confidence first. In this case, the cost was both human and strategic. Countermeasures built on wrong assumptions would be wasted at best and dangerous at worst. A jammed frequency that did not correspond to German equipment would only alert the enemy to new Allied activity. A miscalculated blind spot could leave entire formations vulnerable. British scientists therefore pressed for one thing above all, a piece of incontrovertible technical evidence produced under operational conditions. Getting that evidence, however, posed a problem of trade-offs. Radar emissions could be detected from a distance by listening posts and by specialized aircraft, but correlation of a signal to a specific attacking fighter required proximity under fire. Ground-based direction finding could triangulate approximate bearings, but not always resolve airborne sets operating close to their targets. Intercepted messages and second-hand crew reports provided context, but lacked the precision technicians needed. Carrier frequency in megahertz, pulse width in microseconds, and pulse repetition frequency. Those were the units of engineering, the language that would let physicists translate raw phenomena into effective countermeasures. So planners sketched a daring, ugly solution. Instead of trying to capture a radar set intact or to rely solely on distant listening stations, they would compel the enemy to reveal itself. A bomber, one modified with receivers and manned by a trained special duty operator, would behave like a wounded straggler and coax a night fighter into the kill zone. Once the fighter activated its Lichtenstein or equivalent AI radar, the operator would log the signals on an oscilloscope, record timings, and if possible, radio the data back to base in real time. It was a tactic that converted a tactical loss into strategic gain. A single aircraft's peril could yield the technical knowledge that saved many. This calculus was cold and unapologetic. Commanders weighed the value of intelligence against the possible loss of life and material. In many staff rooms, the argument was clinical. Losing one aircraft to enable jamming that might have nightly loss rates was defensible. Yet on the airfields and in the mess halls there were quieter calculations, the human negotiations with a mission that required men to be both soldiers and instruments. For the crews selected, the order meant accepting a new kind of risk, one not measured in tonnage alone, but in the probability that they would be singled out, engaged, and forced to survive long enough to send back a few key numbers. Operational security tightened around the plan. Only a handful of officers and technicians were briefed. Modified aircraft were prepared away from the prying eyes of casual ground personnel. Radio silence and code procedures were rehearsed to ensure that any transmission could be authenticated and followed. The scientists who would eventually act on the data were put on standby, ready to analyze whatever came through. The success of the mission depended not just on bravery in the air, but on the integrity of a chain that began with a blip on an oscilloscope and ended in lab benches and drafting tables back in England. There was another human element that planners could not measure: faith. The men chosen for this work had to trust that their training, their instruments, and their comrades would catch them if catastrophe struck. They had to hold a mental image of saving others by exposing themselves to danger. That kind of moral arithmetic does not appear on a whiteboard, but it is as essential to any plan as the technical specifications. When the decision was made to go forward with a bait operation, the resolution of engineers and commanders met the quiet resolve of a few aircrews. The next step was to choose the right people, equip the right plane, and write the mission in the most careful language possible, so that when the night swallowed them up, the traces they left on glass and tape might be turned into a way to see in the dark. Number 1474 flight read like an odd footnote in the order of battle, a handful of Wellingtons modified less for destruction than for listening. The unit's outward appearance was deliberately ordinary, same paint, same roundels, same circuit of routine inspections, because its business required invisibility. Beneath that familiar skin, however, each aircraft had been transformed into a flying laboratory. Racks of receivers where bunks might have been, oscilloscope screens bolted into fuselage bays, extra batteries and power supplies tucked into cramped corners, and an array of antennas and feeder cables that would not have looked out of place in a radio station. The Wellington was no accident of choice. Its geodesic construction made the airframe unusually resilient to battle damage. Its internal volume permitted the addition of equipment and an operator's station without crippling crew space, and its handling characteristics were forgiving when compared with more delicate heavy bombers. In short, it could be made into a reliable platform for a mission that might demand both endurance and the ability to limp home when badly damaged. Inside these aircraft, the personnel mix was different too. Alongside the usual pilot, navigator, and gunners was a special duty operator, an expert in signals who was trained to coax information from ether. He was not merely a technician but the mission's primary sensor. His eyes and hands translated invisible pulses into diagrams. His notes would become the blueprint for countermeasures. A wireless operator sat nearby, ready to transmit coded findings back to base as soon as a usable signal was obtained. This pairing, listen and send, were the mission's twin imperatives. Training for these men went beyond routine seamanship of flight and gunnery. They drilled with oscilloscopes until reading a trace became reflex. They practiced identifying pulse repetition frequencies and distinguishing between atmospheric noise, ground returns, and genuine airborne emissions. They rehearsed emergency procedures for damaged radio equipment and learned how to secure instruments so they could keep working even when shrapnel tore through the fuselage. Pilots learned to fly with one eye on the instruments and one on the sky. Navigators practiced keeping a straggler on a plausible course that would tempt an interceptor. Gunners worked drill patterns to maximize survivability while still allowing the special duty operator to function. Operationally, the Wellingtons flew in civilian-like quiet at first, joining bomber streams, hauling along with formations, then executed a precise separation. The straggler script was specific. Simulate mechanical problems, slow deliberately, make subtle course corrections as if struggling to hold station. The logic was simple and savage. An isolated bomber is a prize to a night fighter. The isolated bomber, however, carried the means to convert a likely destruction into a strategic win. If the special duty operator could spot the enemy's radar, and the wireless operator could get the data out. Equipment reflected that duality of purpose. The Heart was a broadband receiver capable of sweeping the bands where German airborne radars were suspected to operate. Its output fed one or more oscilloscopes, their phosphor screens recording traces that showed pulse spacing and amplitude. Alongside these were frequency meters, timing devices synchronized to reliable clockwork, and paper recorders to capture traces for later laboratory analysis. Direction-finding equipment, smaller and less precise than ground goniometers but useful in the air, helped distinguish whether a signal was coming from surface installation or from a smaller, movable source like a fighter. Communications were strictly coded. Any successful interception had to be reported instantly, but radio transmissions themselves were risk-laden. An aircraft broadcasting its findings risked revealing its exact position to the enemy. Thus, the wireless operator's messages were short, formalized, and rehearsed, measurements and authentication codes hammered out in the fewest possible words. The standard operating procedure called for immediate transmission of carrier frequency, pulse repetition, and a concise confirmation phrase. More detailed logs were kept on paper and handed to technicians after landfall. Security around the modified aircraft was tight. Crews worked in small, compartmentalized teams. Equipment arrived and departed on covered trailers. Maintenance was carried out under the watchful eye of officers who understood both aviation and electronics. Physical tests were run to ensure that racks wouldn't come loose under fire and that oscilloscope tubes could survive vibration. In short, the aircraft had to be tough enough to keep listening long enough to gather something useful. But beyond technology and training, the mission depended on temperament. The special duty operator needed the nerve to keep working while tracer seams stitched the sky and cannon stencils punched the fuselage. The wireless operator had to be able to key out a message with bleeding hands and still hit the correct authentication sequence. Pilots and gunners had to be precise, not panicked, flying and shooting in ways that kept the platform stable for the operator to do his work. These were extraordinary human demands that cannot be simulated easily in a hangar. By the time DDG and her crew took their place in the stream on that December night, they were the culmination of all this preparation. A plane hardened for listening, a crew drilled to make every second count, and a mission plan that converted risk into scientific opportunity. It was a fragile alchemy, steel, valves, paper, and human will, but in the calculus of the air war, such combinations sometimes determine the difference between tactical loss and strategic gain. The engines on DG coughed and then settled into the long, steady growl that every bomber crew learned to trust. It was 2:02 on December 3, 1942, the same cold hour when other Wellingtons and Halifaxes were threading themselves into the bomber stream, but for this crew the night had a different shape. Pre-flight checks had been precise and almost ritual. Instrument lamps tested, oscilloscope tube warmed, antenna leads clamped, authentication code memorized and mouthed under breath. A final nod from the flight sergeant, a clipped thumbs up from the ground crew, and Wellington DG rolled down the concrete of RAF Gransden Lodge and lifted into the ink. Ted Paulton felt the machine beneath him as a single animal, heavy, reliable, and capable of withstanding more than its share of insult. He had flown many missions, but tonight there was a distinct edge to everything. Not the jitter of fear, but a tight, professional focus. Beside him, Bill Barry checked headings with the quiet of someone who knew maps the way a carpenter knows his hammer. In the mid-fuselage, Harold Jordan settled in at his receiver station, the oscilloscope's faint glow throwing a blue pallor on his face. Jordan ran his hand over the tuning knobs, once more, felt the click of each detent with long fingers that had worked radio valves and drift meters until those clicks were second nature. The interior of the Wellington smelled of oil, warm cloth, and the faint tang of electricity. Crew banter had been brief and practical in the dim, the kind of talk that keeps hands moving and minds steady. The gunners, Everett Vachon and Fred Grant, ran through their drills in low voices. Their movements were economical, practiced. Bill Bigeray checked the transmitter key and the authentication strips, eyes flicking to the little chart that told him how to compress crucial data into the fewest possible words should the need arise. They climbed, coastlines sliding away beneath them, Cambridgeshire reduced to a smear of darker fields. As they reached the bomber stream and herded in among the shapes of other aircraft, the script of the night snapped into place. DDG looked and sounded like any other Wellington, and that was the point. For a long while everything was routine, formation flying, the muted chorus of engines, the soft ticking of instruments. When the moment came, it was quiet and surgical. Paulton eased back on power, following the plan down to the smallest detail. The Wellington slowed enough to suggest trouble, yet not so much as to be a certain death sentence. The crew performed practice checks that would look genuine to a passing interceptor, an apparent worry about an oil temperature, a mock consult over a suspicious vibration. Barry made a measured course correction that put them on an oblique line away from the main stream, just enough to be plausible, not enough to be lost. Jordan's eyes never left the oscilloscope. The receiver had been preset to sweep bands where German airborne sets were suspected. He listened for the characteristic short, regular pulses that might betray a Lichtenstein in use. The plan relied on coaxing the fighter to switch on its radar, to commit the crime of showing its teeth, and then to let Jordan record that electrical signature as evidence. It was a tiny, terrifying gambit. Go slower, act weaker, and hope a prowling Ju-88 or Mi-110 could be lured close enough that its electronics betrayed it. Outside, the bomber stream thinned as DTG fell back. The cold night seemed to press against the canvas of the fuselage. The distant flashes of flak over enemy territory painted intermittent, pale clocks on the horizon. For a stretched moment the Wellington was a single dark point in a vast sky, an island that must both invite attention and survive it. There was a strange, intimate silence inside the aircraft then, not empty of sound, but full of concentrated purpose. Every man was attending his task as if it were the single most important thing he had ever been asked to do. Ted's hands were light on the wheel. Bigeray's fingers hovered above the transmitter key. Vachon's eyes scanned the night. The plane creaked and shivered under small stresses, the old geodesic skin answering to the bumps of turbulence and the occasional splinter of ice. And then, from the dark ahead, a different kind of voice began to speak on Jordan's scope. Faint at first, a rhythm that did not belong to the natural world. Harold leaned in, thumb finding the gain control, eyes narrowing. The trace steadied, a steady pulse train, short and regular. Jordan's mouth tightened. He ticked off a checklist under his breath, running timing marks and checking carrier stability. He called softly to Barry and Bigeray. Possible Lichtenstein. Hold steady. The crew tightened like a drawn wire. Ted corrected their heading a fraction to maintain the illusion. Barry kept a cool head over the charts and navigation. Bigeray prepared the short coded message he might have to send. The gunners moved to their stations with the calm of men who had rehearsed violence and restraint in equal measure. The gamble had paid its first dividend. The enemy had, in effect, turned on his lights. That small moment, recognition at the oscilloscope, and the quick, practical readiness that followed, was the fulcrum of the whole mission. From here on the night would be immediate and physical. A game of maneuvers, the flash of tracer, the roar of cannon, and the thin, deadly arithmetic of survival. For DTG and her crew, the long hours of preparation were about to be tested in fire. Harold Jordan's hand stayed steady on the tuning knob as the oscilloscope trace resolved into a neat, mechanical heartbeat. He had trained for this kind of moment until the numbers were second nature. Now, in the thin, metallic light of the instrument, he read them aloud in a voice as small as the glow, for 92 megahertz, regular pulse. That's Lichtenstein. The words moved through the fuselage like a signal of their own. Ted Paulton tightened his grip and eased the controls into the shallow bank they had rehearsed, angling DTG away from the bomber stream in the exact way they had practiced. The act was meant to look like a crippled bomber turning back toward home, irresistible bait. Outside, the night seemed to lean in as if it were listening too. "Expect a fighter," Jordan said, clipped and urgent. He set a small piece of paper in front of the oscilloscope and began to mark timings, his other hand flicking the gain and centering traces. Beside him, Bill Bigaret sat at the wireless and prepared the brief, coded transmission that would carry the frequency back to base, a few compressed figures and the authentication code that would prove the reading was genuine. The first strike came, without ceremony. A sudden, rib-rattling crack shredded through the side of the fuselage, an explosion that wasn't thunder or distant flak, but the close, precise percussion of cannon fire. The tracer stuttered across the starboard skin, wood and fabric stippled with hot impacts. Jordan felt a hot, sharp pain in his arm as metal tore flesh. He tasted blood and grit and the smell of cordite. Still, his hands stayed on the oscilloscope. "It's keep recording," he shouted, voice high and raw. From the rear turret, Everett Vachon opened up the twin .303's barking responses into the dark. The Ju-88 that had struck first danced off for a moment and then returned with another run, its guns making a devastating chorus. The second pass shattered turret motors. Flooding and smoke filled the gunnery position as shrapnel chewed through the hydraulic lines. Vachon took a wound in the shoulder, the turret jammed dead. He twisted, swearing, and then pushed himself toward the dorsal astrodome where he could still peer into the black and shout evasive calls to the pilot. The attacks were methodical and brutal. The Ju-88 came in on a series of slashing arcs, then a head-on charge that punched into the Wellington's nose. Fred Grant, manning the front turret, felt the impact as a crushing, stinging blow to his right leg. He gasped and slumped down, blood dark on his uniform. Bill Bigaret, who had been keyed and ready to transmit, abandoned the wireless to help his wounded comrade even as another shell knifed into the nose and sprayed the cockpit with splinters. Pain seared both of Bigaret's legs. He staggered back to his seat, fingers fumbling the key. Jordan was hit again, this time in the jaw and later in the eye. For a terrifying instant the world narrowed to a thin white flash, and then a drifting, fuzzy dim. He blinked against the pain, and refused to let himself fall away. "Get me another set of hands on the scope," he barked, but his voice had the cracked edge of someone not sure he'd be around to give such orders much longer. Ted Paulton's flying became the only consistent instrument in the chaos. He corkscrewed and dived and eased the aircraft into violent, controlled movements designed to make the Ju-88's firing solution unstable. The Wellington shuddered under every hit. Control cables sang as if in pain. Fabric flapped where the skin had been ripped, and instruments leapt like frightened animals in their mounts. Altitude fell from the comfort of 14,000 feet to a perilous low as Paulton fought to keep the wounded plane from pitching into an uncontrollable stall. Despite the damage, the crew reacted with the efficiency of drilled men. Barry, the navigator, crawled where he had to, propping and holding what could be held. Vachon, bloodied and grim, yelled maneuvers and sighting cues from whatever part of the fuselage still offered a clear view. Bigaret, though badly wounded, forced himself back to the transmitter and tapped out their short, vital message, frequency, code, and the single word that would be their lifeline: confirm. His hands shook. He pressed the key down and clamped it so the transmission went out in a continuous, unambiguous pulse. Again and again the Ju-88 came at them. Each pass left a new tally of broken things and bleeding men. The starboard throttle had been shot away, the port throttle jammed hard. The starboard aileron was all but gone. Trim tabs were silent, hydraulic pressure bled away like sap from a wound. The pitot head was shattered, airspeed indicators spun and died. With instruments failing, Paulton flew on feel, listening, judging, and trusting the Wellington's resilient, geodesic frame to do the work of 1,000 rivets. In the middle of one blistering exchange, the Ju-88 punched in close enough that the Wellington's front turret exploded in a cloud of splinters and wiring. Grant went down. Bigaret's legs were hit again by the shrapnel that had torn into the nose. Jordan, staggering and nearly blind in one eye, tried to stay at his station but finally had to call for help as blood blurred the scope and his hand could no longer steady the pen. It was nearly impossible to tell how many attacks they had endured. 10? 11? The number was a blur counted in shock and noise. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pattern broke. The Ju-88 banked away and receded into the black, leaving DTG a ragged silhouette under a sky that had not changed its face. No one on board knew if the fighter had run out of ammunition, been distracted, or simply chosen a different prey. For a moment the silence that followed felt as dangerous as the gunfire. Every creak might be a prelude to another strike. They were alive, but hardly unscathed. The Wellington was a cathedral of damage. Cabin lights flickered. The crew, 4 of 6 wounded, checked each other, and then checked the instruments in a ritual that was equal parts habit and hope. Somewhere in the tangle of pain and smoke, Bigeray managed another breath and tapped out what would become the most important message of the night, an authenticated frequency reading, and a short confirmation that their data had value. As DTG limped on, patched as well as bloodied men and stubborn machines could, the fragile sense of mission remained: get that data home. The rest was how you survived when the sky turned on you. The Wellington that returned from those attacks was no longer merely an aircraft. It was a wounded thing that breathed and held together by will as much as by rivets. The Ju-88's guns had not spared the vital organs. The starboard throttle had been ripped away, the port throttle jammed in a single position. The starboard aileron had been chewed apart, trim survived only in memory. Hydraulics were gone, so were the turret's motors, and the pitot head that fed airspeed instruments had been shattered. Fabric hung in tatters along one side of the fuselage. Instruments flickered and died like candles in a draft. In the cockpit, readings were little more than educated guesses. Paulton had to fly on feel, muscle, and the Wellington's stubborn structural integrity. Yet the plane flew. Its geodesic design, so often praised on paper, proved life-saving in practice. The latticework of the fuselage kept the shell together when cannon and shrapnel tried to rip it apart. Every jolt and groan as the damaged machine held in the air felt like a small miracle, and Ted Paulton, exhausted but implacable, became the engine of that miracle. With one throttle gone and the other jammed, he coaxed the wounded bomber back toward altitude, steadily nursing it from the low hundreds back up to roughly 5,000 feet. It was a delicate balance, power, attitude, and a stubborn faith that the airframe would keep them long enough to cross homeward. Inside, the human ledger of damage was worse than the metals. 4 of the 6 men were hurt, some grievously. Jordan, whose hands had fed the oscilloscope, and whose eyes had first seen the Lichtenstein trace, had been struck repeatedly, once in the arm, later in the jaw and eye. He was weak, nearly blind in one eye, but his jaw and temper kept him fighting to the end. Bigeray's legs were punctured and bleeding. Blood and grit made his uniform a mosaic of pain and purpose. Vachon and Grant were wounded too, each bearing the marks of close-range cannon and machine gun fire. Even wounded, the crew kept working as though habit and training had been welded into them. When Jordan realized his vision was failing, he insisted on teaching the scope to another pair of hands, asking Barry to learn the essential motions so that the mission's data would not be lost if Jordan could not continue. Barry answered without a question, moving across the cramped fuselage to guide the instrument and follow Jordan's short, clipped instructions. Vachon, his turret destroyed, shifted to shouting evasive calls from the Astrodome. When he was wounded in the hand, Barry relieved him there as well. Bigeray, though nearly incapacitated from leg wounds and splinter trauma, kept returning to his transmitter to send the vital, compressed message that would become the key to countermeasures. The aircraft systems, the crew's procedures, and sheer stubbornness combined to create a fragile, functional triage. Paulton held course and altitude where he could. Barry navigated and helped where needed. The gunners and the wounded men did what their training allowed. The wounded shifted positions, improvised braces, and passed tools across bodies, slick with sweat and blood. There was no time for rhetoric, only immediate practical tasks. Stop the bleeding, try to restore a gauge, secure a dangling cable, keep the operator's trace readable. Perhaps more remarkable than the physical damage was the crew's decision-making under pressure. Where panic might have produced random, self-defeating action, they exhibited the opposite. Small, calm acts of choice that kept the plane together and the mission alive. When Jordan's sight failed, he did not panic, he taught. When a turret died, the man who had been in it did not sulk. He rejoined the effort in whatever capacity he could. Bigeray, after twice nearly falling from his station, returned each time to tap out another burst of code. Their collective discipline was the thin margin between likely death and a battered return. Through stripped instruments and shredded skin, the mission's logic still guided them. They had gone out to catch a signal, and they had it. That kernel of data, if it reached analysts, could translate into jamming and deception that might save dozens or hundreds of crews. The thought of that purpose threaded through their movements. It provided context to pain and a reason for stubborn competence. This was not merely survival for themselves, but an act meant to protect others in future nights. As they climbed back to a tenuous stability at 5,000 feet, the Ju-88 had gone. For now, the immediate storm had passed. The Wellington staggered on, systems damaged, crew exhausted, but with the vital prize still in hand, a recorded signal and a transmitted confirmation. They had paid in blood and metal, but the evidence had been won. What remained was the hardest stretch, crossing the channel, making it to home soil, and giving scientists the numbers that would turn this night into leverage against the German night fighters' deadly gaze. When the coast and sea came into view, and the first gray of nearer daylight bled the dark toward pale, the men allowed themselves a moment, short, private, of dread mixed with cautious hope. Survival had never felt so contingent on so many small, exacting choices. The ship had been damaged almost beyond recognition, the men battered, but the mission's core goal still existed. Make it back, transfer the data, heal or mourn as necessary, and let whatever came next be built on the fragile arithmetic of what they had paid. Dawn had not yet brightened when the battered Wellington crossed the French coast. The engines that had carried them through the night now sounded like an old man's labored breath, steady but strained. Inside the fuselage the smell of cordite, oil, and blood hung heavy. Wounds had been dressed as best they could with field dressings. Splinters and fabric were jammed into places to slow bleeding. Ragged courage held the rest together. At 6:45, with the coastline sliding beneath them and the channel between them and home narrowing into a gray seam, Bigoret kept hammering his transmitter. He had already keyed out the vital confirmation of the airborne interception frequency, and despite his injuries, kept repeating the short-coded message so anyone listening could triangulate the position. The message had to be sent. It was the proof the scientists needed. Everything else, comfort, safety, the luxury of certainty, was secondary. The crew discussed ditching in clipped, practical terms. With hydraulics gone, turrets dead, and the airframe riddled, landing at an airfield was increasingly unlikely. Paulton initially planned a ditch in the dark sea, an ugly but familiar decision among airmen who trusted a controlled ditching more than a crash, but the landing lights gave him pause. They failed to illuminate wave crests correctly, and the surface looked a shifting hazard. He decided to wait for a slanted daylight that would make the waves visible. Waiting meant circling the coast, nursing the Wellington, and buying time. As they circled, the crew ran the human inventory aloud. Bigoret's legs throbbed and felt numb. Blood congealed his trousers. Jordan's face was a mask of plaster and dried blood. His right eye was already clouded. Vachon and Grant each had wounds that made movement a chore. The creaking, sighing aircraft felt like a room where every sound was a risk. Each small knock could be the last. When Paulton finally judged the light sufficient, he made the call. Ditching. Bigoret tapped into his key, but at the last second he realized he had not clamped the key down. Memory and habit drove him back to his station despite the pain. He could not risk losing the signal because some listener might not catch the brief burst. With an effort that cost him a scream, he hauled himself back, clamped the transmitter key, and sent out the sustained message that would fix their position for rescuers. Only then did he let himself move toward the escape hatch. For a moment beneath the wing, feet dangling over the open hatch, Bigoret tested the air, the cold cutting through his clothes. He hesitated. The sea below was a flat iron with no welcome in it. He had been thinking that what awaited him, if he jumped, might be a long drift in the channel or a bitter, painful extraction. He remembered the pain of his legs, and the thought of not being able to crawl from sinking plane chilled him more than the water did. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute opened like a white, indifferent flower. He drifted down, the coastline drawing nearer in a ragged, gray ribbon. By fortune and a faint current, he landed ashore near Ramsgate, where locals, already familiar with nighttime wrecks and rescues, hauled him to safety and into the waiting hands of medics. Back aboard the Wellington, flames were beginning to lick the fuselage. The dinghy was released and stuttered into the air, but was riddled with holes from earlier shell strikes and proved unserviceable. With options narrowing, Paulton made a controlled, desperate run toward a stretch of sea off Walmer Beach near Deal. The Wellington struck the water with a terrible, shuddering impact, but did not explode. Instead it shuddered and settled, listing as water lapped and streamed into seams the bomber had never been designed to see filled. The crew moved with the same military economy that had guided them through the night. Vachon released the dinghy, and the men scrambled onto the wing as the Wellington bucked and sighed. The inflatable, patched and gaudy, filled but sagged under the assault of bullet holes. It would not be seaworthy for a long journey. The sea was cold enough to steal breath and make fingers clumsy. The men clung, teeth clenched, waiting for something else to happen. Fortune had not entirely turned its back. Two local fishermen, early to their nets for reasons of habit and hunger, had seen the distant ditching and rowed toward the floating wreck. They cut their lines without question and approached the Wellington with the kind of calm expertise born from working with the sea's moods. Their small boat drew along the wing. In a dozen quick, practiced motions they steadied their skiff, leaned across, and helped the chilled, bloodied men into their craft. The fishermen's faces were unreadable in the gray light. Habit taught them what to do. They wrapped blankets, bound wounds, and cheered with the rough kindness only strangers can afford. One held Paulton's arm steady while the pilot, eyes exhausted and raw with relief, watched his crew shiver and sip tea from a tin cup. The small boat pulled away as the Wellington listed and slid lower until it finally took on too much water and sank stern first beneath a thin thread of smoke. On shore, rescuers and the authorities took over. The 5 men, Bigare already on his way to hospital from Ramsgate, the remaining 5 brought ashore by the fishermen, were rushed in ambulances. In the hours after, surgeons and doctors catalogued wounds. Jordan's right eye had suffered such damage that he would lose sight in it. Bigare's right leg had sustained severe trauma and would need extended care. Vachon's shoulder and hand were badly hurt. Grant's leg, once bound and pale, would require surgery. They were alive, yes, but the cost was immediate and visible. And yet, despite the broken bodies and the sinking machine, there was a hard, bright pride threaded through the gossamer of pain. The radioed frequency had reached those who needed it. The data, recorded on Jordan's scope, confirmed by Bigare's transmission, had become more than numbers by morning. It was leverage. Scientists would take those traces and, in labs far from the channel's cold, begin the work of blinding the very systems that had nearly killed the men who had dared to record them. In hospital wards, amid bandages and the slow, careful work of dressing wounds, the crew's conversation turned to the mission with a fierce, quiet gravity. They spoke less of their own hurts than of the fact that the message had been sent, that someone at Whitehall or a research bench would see the trace and start a plan. Persons and instruments would be repaired, theories adjusted, strips of foil measured. Their own personal reckonings, recovery, pain, the reshaping of futures, would follow too, but in that first pale morning the most immediate fact was a small, stubborn one. They had survived, and what they had survived to send would save others. What the wounded Wellington had given the scientists that morning was not a story, but a specification, a carrier frequency, a pulse rhythm, and a handful of timing marks inked on an oscilloscope trace. In workshops and laboratories that afternoon, the data read like a key. Engineers unrolled graphs, adjusted scales, and began the work of translation, turning a signal into an actionable way to blunt the Luftwaffe's night fighter advantage. The first and most immediate weapon born of that trace was window, what many would call chaff. The idea was simple in concept and fiendishly effective in execution. Create thousands of small, reflective strips tuned to the enemy radar's wavelength, scatter them ahead of or among attacking aircraft, and let the radar see a forest of false targets instead of real machines. From the specific frequency recorded by Jordan's scope, the technicians could calculate an optimal strip length that produced strong radar echo at that band. Trials and iterations followed quickly. The crews who had to carry and release bundles of window learned the choreography of dispersal, and ground handlers learned how to pack the bundles so they would unfurl correctly in flight. The British found a strip length that worked best against the Lichtenstein signature, strips roughly 30 centimeters long by 1.5 centimeters wide, and soon trained squadrons were ready to carry the simple, subversive promise of false echoes out over enemy skies. Window was only the first arrow in a growing quiver. The oscilloscope trace also let scientists design active electronic countermeasures. If you could identify the enemy's carrier frequency and pulse repetition, you could build transmitters that either drowned the signal in noise, broadband jamming, or sent back deceptive pulses that confused the enemy's display. Laboratories adapted valve and transmitter technology to produce powerful, short-burst jammers that could be carried on aircraft or operated from the ground. Those jammers did not render enemy radar instantly blind. Rather, they made the returns ambiguous, raised the operator's workload, and bought a bomber stream precious seconds or meters of safety. The interplay here was clinical and iterative. Engineers tested waveforms in controlled ranges, crews tried the devices in live sorties, and the feedback loop tightened designs into deployable units. A third set of countermeasures was doctrinal and tactical rather than purely technological. Armed with precise knowledge of how Lichtenstein worked, planners and commanders reworked formations, timing, and routes to minimize moments when a single fighter could pick off a straggler. Deception techniques matured. Feints, diversionary streams, and carefully timed cloud of window created confusion that changed the geometry of interception. Bomber streams learned to adjust their spacing, height, and timing to exploit radar dead zones and to reduce the time any one bomber might spend isolated and vulnerable. Training syllabuses were revised to teach gunners and flight officers how to respond when radar jamming or false echoes appeared, because countermeasures could create their own new dangers if crews misinterpreted the resulting chaos. One of the most important features of this period was how quickly laboratory insight moved into the operational sphere. The data pipeline that began with a battered oscilloscope trace ended on night sorties within weeks, not years. That agility came from a tight culture of cooperation. RAF operational planners, signals intelligence specialists, instrument makers, and frontline crews worked in a loop of rapid iteration. When a new jammer waveform was tried, signals officers would monitor both the efficacy against enemy returns and any unintended side effects on Allied equipment. The balance between disruption and reliability was delicate. An overeager transmitter might mask not just the enemy, but also one's own detection tools. There was also an ethical and human dimension to the new forms of warfare. Men who had fought the night with guns and seamanship now found themselves instruments of electromagnetic strategy. Crews on the first window sorties tasted a new kind of victory, strips drifting like ghost limbs across the radar screen, masking thousands of real aircraft, and also a new kind of anxiety. Jamming could change the face of the sky in ways that were hard to predict. Crews learned to trust specialist signals operators who could read the chaotic patterns and advise the pilot. The invisible battlefield had its own specialists, and those specialists became quiet pillars of survivability. The practical results were not instantaneous annihilation of the night fighter threat, but a meaningful reduction in its efficiency. Jamming forced German operators to work harder, to slow their interceptions, and occasionally to misidentify returns. Window created opportunities in which whole streams of aircraft could slip through without presenting clean targeting for a fighter pilot. Combined with improvements in night fighter tactics, better warning, and vectoring from Allied ground-controlled interception, and the continuing refinement of detection gear for RAF night fighters themselves, these countermeasures began to tilt the risk calculus in Bomber Command's favor. The story of that shift is not merely technical, it is a story of trade-offs and adaptation. Each countermeasure invited a countermeasure. Engineers on both sides watched, measured, and responded. But the vital thing that night in December had accomplished was to supply the Allies with a hard datum from which all subsequent work could grow. Without the frequency, the pulse shape, and the authenticated message that Big Array had hammered out, researchers would have been guessing in the dark. With it, they had a starting point. By the time the wounded crews were recovering in hospital beds and recounting the tale to visiting officers, large glass-fronted rooms full of oscilloscopes and men in white coats were already putting the data to work. They measured, calculated, packaged, and instructed. In weeks, experiments on chaff, on jamming transmitters, and on altered operational patterns began to appear in the equipment lockers of squadrons. The invisible war had been given tools, its practitioners a new confidence. The cost remained real, immediate, and solemn. Men had been hurt, one eye damaged, legs wounded, hands scarred. But from their suffering came a weapon that was not a bomb and not a bullet, a set of practices and small technologies that would take the sting from many future nights. Their sacrifice had turned an oscilloscope trace into a means to keep others alive. If the first countermeasure, window, was the most immediately visible result of their data, the work that followed quietly changed the shape of the night war. The next chapter, however, was not only about craft and cunning. It would be about how quickly the enemy learned, adapted, and responded. The race, after all, continued.